One day, Edward was in the shed where he lived with the other engines. They were all bigger than Edward and boasted about it. "The driver won't choose you again," said Gordon. "He wants strong engines like us." But the driver and fireman felt sorry for Edward. "Would you like to come out today?" "Oh, yes, please," said Edward. So they lit his fire, made lots of steam, and Edward puffed away. The other engines were very cross at being left behind. Edward worked hard all day. The coaches thought he was very kind, and the driver was very pleased. "I'm going out again tomorrow," Edward told the other engines that night. "What do you think of that?" But he didn't hear what they thought, for he was so tired and happy that he fell asleep at once. Next morning, Edward woke up to find nothing had changed. Gordon was still boasting. "You watch me, little Edward, as I rush through with the express. That will be a splendid sight for you. Goodbye, little Edward. Look out for me this afternoon." Edward went off to do some shunting. He liked shunting. It was fun playing with freight cars. He would come up quietly and give them a push. Then he would stop, and the silly freight cars would go bump into each other. "Oh!" they cried. "Whatever is happening?" Edward played till there were no more freight cars. Then he stopped to rest. Presently, he heard a whistle. Gordon was cross. Instead of nice shining coaches, he was pulling a dirty freight train. "A freight train, a freight train, a freight train," he grumbled. "The shame of it, the shame of it, oh, the shame of it." Edward laughed and went to find some more freight cars. Then there was trouble. "Gordon can't get up the hill," the porter called to Edward's driver. "Will you take Edward and push him, please?" They found Gordon halfway up and very cross. His driver and fireman were talking to him severely. "You're not trying." "I can't do it," said Gordon. "The noisy freight cars hold an engine back so." Edward's driver came up. "We've come to push." "No use at all," said Gordon. "You wait and see," replied Edward's driver. They brought the train back to the bottom of the hill. "I'm ready," said Edward. "No good," grumbled Gordon. They pulled and pushed as hard as they could. "I can't do it! I can't do it! I can't do it!" puffed Gordon. "I will do it! I will do it! I will do it!" puffed Edward. Edward pushed and puffed and puffed and pushed as hard as ever he could. And almost before he realized it, Gordon found himself at the top of the hill. "I've done it! I've done it! I've done it!" he said proudly. He forgot all about kind Edward and didn't say thank you. Edward was left out of breath and far behind, but he was happy because he had been so helpful. At the next station, he found that the driver and fireman were very pleased with him. The fireman gave him a nice long drink, and the driver said, "I'll get out my paint tomorrow and give you a beautiful coat of blue with red stripes. Then you'll be the smartest engine in the shed." Sir Topham Hatt works his engines hard, but they are very proud when he calls them really useful. "I'm going to the scrapyard today," Edward called to Thomas. "What, already? You're not that old," replied Thomas cheekily. Thomas was only teasing. The scrapyard is full of rusty old parts and machinery. They're broken into pieces, loaded into cars, and Edward pulls them to the steelworks where they are melted down and used again. Today, there was a surprise waiting for Edward in the yard. It was a traction engine. "Hello," said Edward. "You're not broken and rusty. What are you doing here?" "I'm Trevor. They're going to break me up next week." "What a shame," said Edward. "My driver says I only need some paint, polish, and oil to be as good as new, but my owner says I'm old-fashioned." Edward snorted. "People say I'm old-fashioned, but I don't care. Sir Topham Hatt says I'm a useful engine. What work did you do?" "My owner would send us from farm to farm. We threshed corn, hauled logs, and did lots of other work. The children loved to see us." Trevor shut his eyes, remembering. "Oh, yes, I like children." Edward set off for the station. "Broken up, what a shame. Broken up, what a shame. I must help Trevor, I must." He thought of all his friends who liked engines, but strangely, none of them would have room for a traction engine at home. "It's a shame, it's a shame," he hissed. Then, beep, beep. Why didn't I think of him before? There on the platform was the very person. "Hello, Edward. You look upset." "What's the matter, Charlie?" he asked the driver. "There's a traction engine in the scrapyard, Vicar. He'll be broken up next week. Jem Cole says he never drove a better engine." "Do save him, sir. He saws wood and gives children rides." "We'll see," replied the vicar. Jem Cole came on Saturday. "The Reverend is coming to see you, Trevor. Maybe he'll buy you." "Do you think he will?" asked Trevor. "He will when I've lit your fire and cleaned you up." The vicar and his two boys arrived that evening. Trevor hadn't felt so happy for months. He chuffered about the yard. "Show your paces, Trevor," said the vicar. Later, he came out of the office smiling. "I've got him cheap, Jem, cheap." "Do you hear that, Trevor?" cried Jem. "The Reverend saved you, and you'll live at the vicarage now." "Beep, beep," whistled Trevor. Now Trevor's home is in the vicarage orchard, and he sees Edward every day. His paint is spotless, and his brass shines like gold. Trevor likes his work, but his happiest day is the church fair. With a wooden seat bolted to his bunker, he chuffers round the orchard, giving rides to children. Long afterward, you'll see him shut his eyes, remembering. "I like children," he whispers happily. Duck and Boko saw to it that Edward was left in peace. Bertie the bus was giving some visitors a tour of the island of Soda. It was their last afternoon, and Edward was preparing to take them to meet Bill and Ben. He found it hard to start the heavy train. "Did you see him straining?" asked Henry. "Positively painful," remarked James. "Just pathetic," grunted Gordon. "He should give up and be preserved before it's too late." "Shut up," burst out Duck. "You're all jealous. Edward's better than any of you." "You're right, Duck," said Boko. "Edward's old, but he'll surprise us all." "I've done it. We're off." "I've done it. We're off," said Edward as he finally puffed out of the station. Bill and Ben were delighted to see the visitors. They loved being photographed. Later, they took the party to the China Clay Works in a brake van special. Everyone had a splendid time, and the visitors were most impressed. Then Edward took the visitors home. On the way, the weather changed. Wind and rain buffeted Edward. His sanding gear failed, and his fireman rode in front, dropping sand on the rails by hand. Suddenly, Edward's wheels slipped fiercely, and with a shrieking crack, something broke. The crew inspected the damage. Repairs took some time. "One of your crank pins broke, Edward," said his driver. "We've taken your side rods off. Now you're like an old-fashioned engine. Can you get these people home? They must start back tonight." "I'll try, sir," promised Edward. Edward puffed and pulled his hardest, but his wheels kept slipping, and he could not start the heavy train. The passengers were anxious. The driver, fireman, and conductor went along the train, making adjustments between the coaches. "We've loosened the couplings, Edward. Now you can pick up your coaches one by one, just as you do with freight cars." "That'll be much easier," said Edward. "Come on," he puffed and moved cautiously forward. The first coach moving helped to start the second, and the second helped the third. "I've done it! I've done it!" puffed Edward. "Steady, boy," warned his driver. "Well done, boy! You've got them! You've got them!" And he listened happily to Edward's steady beat as he forged slowly but surely ahead. At last, battered, weary, but unbeaten, Edward steamed in. Henry was waiting for the visitors with the special train. Beep, beep. Sir Topham Hatt angrily pointed to the clock, but excited passengers cheered and thanked Edward, his driver, and fireman. Duck and Boko saw to it that Edward was left in peace. Gordon and James remained respectfully silent. He was taking empty cattle cars to a market town. Edward was getting old. His bearings were worn, and he clanked as he puffed along. He was taking empty cattle cars to a market town. The sun shone, birds sang. But Edward was heading for trouble. Come on, he puffed. "Oh, oh!" screamed the cars. Edward puffed and clanked. The cars rattled and screamed. Some cows were grazing nearby. They were not used to trains. The noise and smoke disturbed them. As Edward clanked by, they broke through the fence and ran across the line. A coupling was broken and some cars were left behind. Edward felt a jerk, but didn't take much notice. He was used to cattle cars. Bother those cars, he thought. Why can't they come quietly? He was at the next station before either he or his driver realized what had happened. When Gordon and Henry heard about the accident, they laughed and boasted. "Fancy allowing cows to break your train. They wouldn't dare do that to us. We'd show them." Old Toby was cross. You couldn't help it, Edward. They've never met cows. I have, and I know the trouble they are. Some days later, Gordon rushed through Edward's station. Boop, boop. Mind the cows. Hurry, hurry, puffed Gordon. Don't make such a fuss. Don't make such a fuss, grumbled his coaches. A long stretch of line lay ahead. In the distance was a bridge. It seemed to Gordon that there was something on the bridge. His driver thought so too. Whoa, Gordon, he said and shut off steam. Whew, said Gordon. It's only a cow. Shoo! Shoo! He moved slowly onto the bridge, but the cow wouldn't shoo. She had lost her calf and felt lonely. Bleh, she said sadly. Everyone tried to send her away, but she wouldn't go. Henry arrived. What's this? A cow? I'll soon settle her. Be off! Be off! Bleh. Henry backed away nervously. I don't want to hurt her. At the next station, Henry's conductor told them about the cow and warned the signalman that the line was blocked. That must be Bluebell, said the porter. Her calf is here, looking for her mother. Percy will take her along. At the bridge, Bluebell was very pleased to see her calf again, and the porter led them away. Not a word. Keep it secret, whispered Gordon and Henry to each other. They felt rather silly, but the story soon spread. Well, 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 chuckled Edward. Two big engines afraid of a cow. Afraid? Rubbish, said Gordon. We didn't want the poor thing to hurt herself by running up against us. We stopped so as not to excite her. You see what I mean, my dear Edward? Yes, Gordon, said Edward. Gordon felt somehow that Edward saw only too well. The fireman was ready when Edward arrived. One day, James had to wait at the station till Edward and his train came in. This made him cross. Late again! Edward laughed and James fumed away. After James had finished his work, he went back to the yard and puffed onto the turntable. He was still feeling very bad-tempered. Edward is impossible, he grumbled to the others. He clanks about like a lot of old iron, and he is so slow, he makes us wait. Thomas and Percy were indignant. Old iron? Slow? Why, Edward could beat you in a race any day. Really, said James. I should like to see him do it. Next morning, James's driver was suddenly taken ill. He could hardly stand, so the fireman uncoupled James ready for shunting. James was impatient. Suddenly, the signalman shouted. There was James puffing away down the line. All traffic halted, called the signalman. Then he told the fireman what had happened. Two boys were on James's footplate fiddling with the controls. Phew! They tumbled off and ran when James started. The signalman answered the telephone. Yes? He's here. Right. I'll tell him. The inspector's coming at once. He wants a shunter's pole and a coil of wire rope. What for? Wondered the fireman. Search me, but you'd better get them quickly. The fireman was ready when Edward arrived. The inspector saw the pole and the rope. Good man, jump in. We'll catch him, puffed Edward. James was laughing. What a lark! What a lark! He chuckled to himself. Suddenly, he was going faster and faster. He realized that he had no driver. What shall I do? I can't stop! Help! Help! We're coming, called Edward. Edward was panting up behind with every ounce of steam he had. At last, he caught up with James. Steady, Edward, called his driver. The inspector stood on Edward's front, holding a noose of rope and the crook of the shunter's pole. He was trying to slip it over James's buffer. The engines swayed and lurched. At last, got him, he shouted. He pulled the noose tight. Gently braking, Edward's driver checked the engine speed, and James's fireman scrambled across and took control. So, the old iron caught you after all, chuckled Edward. I'm sorry, whispered James. Thank you for saving me. You were splendid, Edward. That's all right, replied Edward. The engines arrived at the station side by side. Sir Topham Hatt was waiting. A fine piece of work, he said. James, you can rest and then take your train. I'm proud of you, Edward. You shall go to the works and have your worn parts mended. Oh, thank you, sir, said Edward. It'll be lovely not to clank.
When engines have heavy loads, Edward buffers up behind and helps push. The engines on the island of Sodor are good at different things. Gordon is a very good express. Percy is good at carrying the mail. And when Edward is not hauling freight cars, he is very good at being a back engine. When engines have heavy loads, Edward buffers up behind and helps push. But Edward is old. Some engines think this makes him unreliable.
Edward is a useless old steam pot, Gordon sniffed. He should be retired.
But he doesn't have tires, Percy said. Retired, said Thomas, means taken out of service.
And not a moment too soon,
said Gordon. And the other big engines agreed with him. But Percy was very upset. Later, his driver asked him why he looked so glum. Percy told him about Edward. The big engines don't think he's useful anymore, he said. Percy's driver saw Sir Topham Hatt and told him what Percy had said.
I will attend to the matter immediately,
said Sir Topham Hatt. Sir Topham Hatt had a plan.
The new loop line is completed, he said to Edward. I want you to teach Stepney how to run it properly.
But sir, he asked, who will look after the freight cars?
Duck will do your work,
Sir Topham Hatt replied. When the other engines heard Duck was going to help them, they were pleased. Duck is very reliable, said Henry.
It makes no difference to me, said Gordon pompously. I don't need a back engine.
And he wheeshed away. Edward enjoyed working with Stepney. It was great fun delivering passengers to stations in the beautiful countryside. But Duck was not happy. The trucks were playing their silly games. Duck should play with other ducks because he's no good at pulling trucks. Quack, 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 quack. Hold back, they giggled. Duck found himself going slower and slower and slower. Halfway up Gordon's hill, his wheels stopped altogether. Duck was stuck. Oh no, said his driver. This is Gordon's line. Duck's guard phoned the signalman to warn him. It's too late to switch Gordon to the middle line, said the signalman. You'll have to flag him down. Gordon saw the guard. If I stop on this hill, I'll never get started again, he said crossly, and he buffered up to Duck. Gordon tried to set off again, but his wheels spun and spun. It's no use. We need a back engine, said the driver. I'll send for Edward. Gordon was cross. Edward was excited. He was going to be the back engine for 2 trains. Edward cheerfully buffered up and the strange train set off. They chuffed gently into the station. Look at that, laughed a boy. The back engine must be the strongest and the best. Gordon was embarrassed. Sir Topham Hatt spoke severely to Gordon. You have said rude things about Edward. He proved today that he is useful, reliable, and very helpful. Gordon felt very ashamed. The next morning, Gordon apologized. Thank you for helping me, Edward, puffed Gordon. You really are a useful engine. It's good to be back, Edward chuffed happily. Sir Topham Hatt's plan had worked. There was no more talk about Edward retiring.
Newfangled nonsense, Percy, puffed Edward as grandly as he could. Edward strikes out. All the engines of Sodor are very happy to work on Sir Topham Hatt's railway. Edward has worked on the railway the longest. He knows everyone, and everyone knows him. One summer morning, Edward arrived at the docks. He had to pick up some heavy pipes. Gordon and Thomas were already there. Thomas was very excited. A new crane had just arrived on the island. He looks so strong, puffed Thomas. I'm sure he could even lift you up, Gordon, he chuckled. Gordon didn't think this was funny, and Thomas chuffed away.
That crane might be big,
Gordon sniffed.
but he has no engine. He can't move unless another engine pulls him.
Edward looked at the crane. Gordon was right. Then I don't think he can be really useful, chuffed Edward slowly.
Quite right, Edward,
Huffed Gordon.
he will only get in the way.
Just then, Percy arrived. He was very excited to see the new crane too.
He's not very useful,
Boomed Gordon. He will only get in the way, echoed Edward.
Newfangled nonsense.
Wheeshed Gordon, and he chuffed off. What's a newfangled nuisance, Edward? Peeped Percy. Newfangled nonsense, Percy, puffed Edward, as grandly as he could. It's something that is new and not really useful. Edward's freight cars were right next to the new crane.
My name's Rocky.
The crane smiled at Edward. I'm Edward, puffed Edward.
Can I come with you?
Asked Rocky.
I could help you with those heavy pipes.
I don't need your help, sniffed Edward. Newfangled nonsense. And he puffed away before the pipes had been properly tied down. Edward was approaching a signal. He was thinking about Rocky and he was going too fast. Suddenly, the signal changed to red. Edward screeched to a stop, but the sides of the freight cars collapsed. Steel pipes toppled all over the tracks.
Bust my buffers,
puffed Edward. He looked at the heavy pipes and wondered what to do. Thomas had said Rocky was very strong. Newfangled nonsense, huffed Edward, and he asked his driver to telephone for Harvey. Harvey puffed and chuffed as fast as he could to the rescue. Harvey started to move the pipes, but the pipes were heavy. He could only lift them one by one.
This is going to take me a very long time,
gasped Harvey. Just then, Thomas and Emily arrived. They saw the pipes. We have to get through, tooted Thomas. Why don't you go and get Rocky?
No,
whistled Edward.
Harvey is doing a fine job. We must be patient.
I don't like being patient, pouted Emily. We have a very important job to do. Then they heard Gordon. He was going fast. Then there was trouble. Gordon hit the pipes with a loud crunch. He came off the tracks. It was a terrible mess.
I can't lift Gordon,
sighed Harvey.
He's too heavy.
Edward, we need Rocky, tooted Thomas. Gordon sniffed.
Newfangled nonsense.
But Edward knew this was a disaster, and he knew Harvey couldn't lift Gordon. There was only one thing to do.
I'll go and get Rocky,
Edward wheeshed, and he raced off. Edward steamed into the docks.
Rocky, we need your help,
he whistled.
It's an emergency.
I'm ready and waiting, Edward,
whistled Rocky happily. So Edward buffered up to Rocky, and together they left for the junction.
Go get him, Edward.
Edward pulled Rocky up hills and down valleys. Everyone cheered and waved at them. Edward felt very proud to be pulling the latest arrival on Sodor. Edward soon pulled up with Rocky.
I can fix this,
Rocky smiled. And with his mighty crane arm, Rocky lifted Gordon back onto the track. Gordon was surprised.
Thank you, Rocky,
he huffed.
Good work.
Then, Rocky lifted all the pipes off the rails. The job was done in no time. Gordon and Edward were very impressed.
I was silly to think you were newfangled nonsense,
wheezed Edward to Rocky.
You might be new, but you're also really useful. Welcome to our island.
And everyone tooted and cheered for Rocky.
To tease Edward, especially Gordon.
It's a shame you're such an old engine, Edward.
Old, reliable Edward. Edward is one of the older engines on the island of Sodor. He is a mixed traffic engine, which means sometimes he pulls coaches and sometimes he pulls cars. He's not the smallest engine, but he's not that big either. Some of the bigger engines like to tease Edward, especially Gordon.
It's a shame you're such an old engine, Edward. You're not very reliable.
What do you mean?
You know, breaking down all the time.
I haven't broken down in ages.
Oh, really?
Sir Topham Hatt knows that Edward is a really useful engine, and that is why he's given him his own branch line, the line that runs to Brendam Docks. One day, Gordon was pulling the express on Gordon's Hill when he thought he saw a red flag blowing beside the track.
Oh, no! That's a danger signal. I'd better stop. That's not a danger signal. Those are red.
It was a pair of pants that had blown off a washing line. Then there was trouble. Gordon couldn't start up again on the steep hill with his long, heavy express coaches.
Oh.
Edward had just arrived at Wellsworth Station when the station master stopped him.
Gordon is stuck on his hill. He needs a banker engine to give him a push.
Not again. And he says I'm the one that's unreliable. Honestly.
Gordon was waiting very impatiently for Edward when Emily came along.
Having a rest, are you, Gordon?
I wish Edward would get here and give me a push before any more engines see me.
Oh, dear, Gordon. I see you've got stuck on your hill again.
It wasn't my fault, Thomas. There were some red pants by the track, and they looked like a danger signal.
Red pants? Danger signal?
By the time Edward arrived, Gordon was rather cross.
You took your time, Edward. You're so old and slow, I'm surprised Sir Topham Hatt keeps you on.
You're not moving very quickly yourself, Gordon.
Gordon was still fuming as Edward pushed him up the hill.
Express coming through!
Aren't you even gonna say thank you? Why is Gordon so ungrateful? He doesn't even say thank you when I give him a push. He only says how old and unreliable I am.
Maybe it's time we taught that big engine a lesson.
That night in the sheds, Thomas and the other engines were teasing Gordon about what had happened.
And the only reason he stopped was because he saw some red pants.
Gordon claims to be fast and reliable, but he still needed my help to get over the hill.
I didn't really need your help, Edward. You just happened to be there, that's all. I'm very reliable and exceedingly fast.
Is that so? I'd like to see you go faster than me.
Go faster than you? Don't be silly, Thomas. That's too easy.
Very well. You just try and follow me tomorrow morning.
No problem at all. I'll even give you a 10-minute head start.
The other engines thought Thomas was being very silly if he thought he could go faster than Gordon. The next morning, Thomas met Gordon at Knapford Station as agreed.
Ready, Gordon?
You'd better get going, Thomas. I did promise you a 10-minute head start, remember?
I remember.
I do hope you know what you're doing, Thomas. We don't want to look silly.
Don't worry. Everything is under control.
Thomas was out ahead on the main line, but he knew Gordon was going to catch up soon.
Thomas, I can see Gordon behind us. He's going to pass us.
We'll see about that.
Pull onto the other track, Thomas. Express coming through.
Oh, no. That's not what we agreed, Gordon. You said you'd follow me across the island.
Follow you? But, oh, can't you go any faster?
Thomas could go faster, but he didn't. And when they got to Gordon's Hill, Thomas started to go even slower.
Speed up, Thomas! Speed up! I don't want to get stuck again!
But Thomas didn't speed up. He went slower and slower until...
No! I'm stuck again.
It looks like I'm going faster than you after all.
Oh.
Hello, Gordon. Have you given up following Thomas already?
Thomas tricked me, Edward. He went too slow.
Oh, dear. But I must say, you don't seem very reliable. Always getting stuck on your own hill.
Wait, Edward! You need to give me a push.
Oh, but I didn't think you needed any help from me. After all, I'm so old and unreliable.
But I do need your help. I promise not to call you old or unreliable anymore. Please.
Okay, Gordon. I think you've learned your lesson now. And what do you say?
Oh, the indignity.
Sorry?
I mean, thank you. Thank you, Edward.
You're welcome, Gordon. Anytime.